In the fall of 2019, two experienced cave divers dropped into a flooded system in the Missouri Ozarks. They were mapping a passage no one had ever fully surveyed. Somewhere past the last known chamber, below the depth where groundwater should have made the surrounding rock behave in slow, predictable ways, they found a room the geology did not account for. Squared off, walls meeting at angles too clean to be an accident of water and time. They measured it, they photographed it, they began the paperwork that every serious cave survey in the state requires, and then the survey was never filed, not lost in a flood, not misplaced in a county archive. Filed, in the older sense of the word, filed away. This is the part of the story that people argue about, not whether the chamber exists, whether the reason it vanished from the record is boring, or whether it is the most interesting thing to come out of North American groundwater in a century. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. To understand why anyone would care about a wet room under a hill in a state most people fly over, you have to understand what the divers thought they were looking at. And you have to understand why that particular shape, in that particular place, makes a small number of researchers very uncomfortable. Let's start with the water. The Ozark Plateau sits on top of one of the largest karst systems in the country. Karst is what you get when slightly acidic water spends millions of years eating through limestone and dolomite. It carves tunnels. It hollows out rooms. It leaves behind the sinkholes, springs, and caves that make southern Missouri look, from below, like a sponge. Divers have been pushing into these systems for decades, and the community that does it is small. Everyone knows everyone. A find gets talked about at the dive shop before the paperwork is dry. So when the survey for this particular system stopped appearing in the usual places, people noticed. The lead diver had a reputation for being meticulous. He logged everything. He was the kind of man who would note the water temperature to the 10th of a degree and complain if his buddy rounded it. He was not the kind of man who forgot to file a survey. The second diver saw it too. She was less willing to talk and less willing to guess, but she never contradicted a word of his account. When people pressed her, years later, she would say only that the room was not right and that she had wanted to leave it before he did. She was not a nervous diver. She had put more hours underwater than most people put behind a steering wheel. When a diver like that says a room is not right, the reason is usually pressure or air, or a line that has gone slack in the dark. She said it was none of those. She said it was the shape. The system itself does not have a famous name, and the people who know which one it is have mostly agreed to keep it that way. What can be said is that it drains into a spring that locals have used for as long as there have been locals, and that the upper passages were mapped decades ago by an earlier generation of cavers who never mentioned anything unusual. That is not surprising. The upper passages are dry, wide, and ordinary. The room was well past the last dry survey, past the sump, in the flooded section that only a handful of people in the state are equipped to reach. Whatever is down there was, for all practical purposes, sealed from the world until two people with the right training and the wrong luck swam into it. His name does not matter for this story, and honestly, that is by his own request. What matters is what he described to the 2 or 3 people he trusted before he stopped talking about it entirely. He said the passage narrowed to a squeeze about 90 feet down, in fresh water, well below the local water table. Past the squeeze, the tunnel opened. That is normal. Caves do that. What was not normal was the floor. He said the floor was flat. Not flat the way a slab of bedrock can look flat in a headlamp. Flat the way a floor is flat. Level across a span that his instruments put at just over 40 feet. With a variance so small he assumed his gauge was broken. He checked the gauge topside. The gauge was fine. Now, a level floor 40 feet across is strange, but it is not impossible for nature to fake. Water finds a level. Sediment settles. Given enough time, a lake bed can lie down almost perfectly flat and then turn to stone. If that were all he found, this would be a footnote. But the walls were the problem. The walls rose from that floor at a consistent angle, and where two walls met, they met in a corner. A real corner. And above the corner, spanning the gap where the ceiling should have collapsed a long time ago, there was an arch. This is where we have to slow down, because the word arch is doing a lot of work, and it is the word that changes everything. In the world of accepted history, the arch is a technology. Someone had to invent it. The load-bearing arch, the kind that carries weight by pushing it outward into its supports instead of letting it fall straight down, shows up in the record at a specific time, built by specific hands, and it spreads from there. It is one of the cleanest markers we have for a certain level of engineering. You do not get true arches by accident. Water does not build them. Frost does not build them. They are a decision. He looked for the keystone. That is the first thing anyone who knows arches looks for, the wedge at the top that locks the whole span together and turns a pile of stone into a structure that can carry a mountain. He said it was there. A single element at the crown, wider at the bottom than the top, seated between the two halves of the span exactly where the physics would demand it. He was not an engineer, but he had built things with his hands. He knew what a keystone was for, and he knew that water does not carve wedges and set them at the top of a gap by accident. If he was right about that one detail, the argument was effectively over, because a keystone is not a shape, it is an idea. It is the solution to a specific problem, and the only things that arrive at that solution are minds. So, a load-bearing arch, cut or cast into the rock of a chamber that sits under the Missouri water table, is not a geology problem, it is a history problem. And history problems, when they are big enough, have a way of not getting filed. Here is where the second thread of this story comes in, and it is the thread that pulls the whole thing into territory the mainstream would rather leave alone. For the last several years, a loose group of researchers, most of them outside the universities, have been arguing that the standard timeline of the built world is wrong. Not wrong by a few decades, wrong by a category. They look at old infrastructure, at foundations that seem too large for the towns built on top of them, at stonework that appears in places the textbook says had no one capable of cutting it, and they ask a simple, uncomfortable question. What if a great deal of what we call ancient was not built by the hands we were told built it? What if there was an earlier phase of construction, an earlier economy, something organized and capable, and then, for reasons nobody agrees on, gone? The name that gets attached to this idea, fairly or not, is Tartaria. And the moment you say that word, half your audience rolls their eyes and the other half leans in. That is fine. You do not have to accept the whole framework to notice that it asks a real question about a real gap. The gap is this. Across the world, there is a strange amount of heavy, permanent, expensive construction whose paper trail is thin. The buildings are there. The receipts are not. The divers in Missouri did not set out looking for any of that. They were mapping a cave. But when the lead diver came up and started trying to explain what he had seen, the only people who took him seriously were the ones already asking the uncomfortable question. And that, more than anything, is how the survey ended up filed away instead of filed properly. Once a find gets associated with the wrong crowd, it becomes radioactive. No serious institution wants to be the one that put its name on the chamber under the hill. The divers themselves split on it, the way small communities always split on a thing they cannot resolve. Some decided the lead diver had lost his edge, that the room was a normal formation dressed up by a mind under stress, and that the smart move was to forget the whole business before it damaged anyone's reputation. Others believed him completely and were quietly furious that no one with authority would go and look. Most landed in the uncomfortable middle, half convinced, unwilling to stake anything on it, waiting for someone else to either prove it or bury it. That middle is where most of these stories live, and it is exactly the ground that lets them fade. A claim that half of a community privately believes, and none of it will publicly defend, is a claim with no future. It does not get funded. It does not get filed. It gets remembered, imperfectly, by the people who were there, and then it gets forgotten with them. But let's go back down, because the details matter, and the details are where this stops being a vibe and starts being a problem. The lead diver described the wall surface as smooth, not polished, but worked. He said that when he ran his glove across it, it did not catch the way natural dolomite catches. Natural rock in a cave has a texture, It has the record of its own dissolving written all over it, little scallops and flutes where the water moved fast or slow. This surface did not have that. It had a texture, he compared, and he hated this comparison because he knew how it sounded, to poured concrete that had been finished by a trowel and then left alone for a very long time. That comparison is the hinge of the entire story, so we should sit with it. There is an idea, unpopular in the departments that hand out degrees but stubbornly alive outside them, that a lot of old monumental stone was not quarried and carved at all, that it was cast. That the builders had some way of turning raw mineral material into a slurry, pouring it into forms and letting it harden into something that looks, to us, like natural stone that was cut with impossible precision. If that were true, it would explain a lot of things that are otherwise hard to explain. It would explain why some ancient blocks fit together with no gap. It would explain why some surfaces look moulded rather than chiseled. It would explain why we find, in the corners of certain old walls, shapes that would be maddening to carve but simple to pour. And it would mean that the economy that produced these things was not an economy of thousands of labourers with copper tools and endless time. It would be an economy of chemistry, of formula, of something closer to a factory than a quarry. That is a completely different kind of civilization, with completely different books, and almost none of those books survive. So when a careful, skeptical cave diver comes up out of the water and says the wall felt like cured slurry, the people who study the cast stone idea do not laugh. They get very quiet. Because a cast surface, sealed under fresh water below the water table, protected from weather and sun and human hands for however long it has been down there, would be one of the best preserved samples anyone could hope to find. It would be a sample you could test. And a test is exactly the thing the argument has always been missing. There is another piece of the revisionist framework that fits this chamber a little too well, and it is worth naming even though it is the piece that draws the most ridicule. The idea is that at some point, not so long ago as these things go, large parts of the built world were buried. Not by a single flood in the biblical sense, but by a wave of sediment, mud, and displaced earth that came up around the ground floors of standing buildings and swallowed whole lower levels that we now dig out and call basements. Look at old buildings in old cities, the argument goes, and you will find windows below the current sidewalk, arched doorways that lead into packed dirt, entire first floors that are now underground for no structural reason anyone can give. Set aside whether that happened everywhere. Ask only what it would take to put a finished, arched, cast stone chamber 90 feet down, sealed under fresh water, in the middle of a continent. You would need it to be buried, and then you would need the water to rise, or the land to sink, or both. A cast system is exactly the kind of place where land quietly drops and water quietly rises over spans of time that make the process invisible. If you wanted to hide something built on the surface, permanently, without anyone ever deciding to hide it, you could hardly design a better mechanism than a flooding cave in a sinking plateau. The room may not have been built under the water table. The water table may have come to it. This is the point where I want to be honest with you about what we know and what we are guessing, because this story does not need to be inflated and it does not deserve to be flattened. What we can be fairly confident about is that a chamber was found, that it was measured, that photographs were taken, and that the expected paperwork did not appear where it should have appeared. That much has been described by more than one person, and the description has stayed consistent over time, which is more than you can say for most stories that circulate in this space. What we are guessing about is everything that makes it interesting. Whether the arch was truly load-bearing, or just a coincidence of fracture. Whether the flat floor was engineered, or simply an old, still lake bed turned to rock. Whether the wall was cast, or whether a tired man 90 feet down in cold water, breathing from a tank, felt something his mind wanted to make into a story. Divers are human. Depth plays tricks. Cold plays tricks. Nobody in this story is immune to that, and the diver himself said as much. But here is what keeps the thing from being easy to dismiss. He went back. He was not satisfied with a story. He wanted the sample. He wanted the test. He organized a second descent, a careful one, with the intention of chipping a small, clean fragment from a spot that would not damage the structure, bringing it up, and handing it to someone with a laboratory and no dog in the fight. He wanted to end the argument the honest way, And on that second dive, before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. According to the people he told, 2 things happened. The first is that he took the sample, a small piece from the base of one wall where the surface met the flat floor. The second is that when he surfaced and looked at the fragment in daylight, it did not look like limestone. It did not look like dolomite. It looked, he said, like an aggregate. Like small particles held in a matrix, the way gravel sits in cement, natural stone can look like that too. Conglomerate rock is exactly that, a natural cement of older fragments. So on its own, the fragment proved nothing, but it was testable. Finally, there was a thing you could put under a microscope and settle. And this is where the story goes cold, in the way these stories always seem to go cold right at the moment they might have become undeniable. The sample was sent for analysis. Where and to whom is one of the details that shifts depending on who is telling it. Some say a private lab, some say a contact at a university who agreed to look quietly. What everyone agrees on is that the results, if they ever came back, never reached the people who were waiting for them. The diver stopped returning messages. The survey never appeared. The location, which a small number of people knew, stopped being talked about. And within a year, the entrance to that section of the system was, according to the divers who tried to return, no longer passable. A collapse, they were told. Ozark caves collapse. It happens. It happens. But the timing is the kind of timing that makes people who are inclined to see patterns see a very clear one. If the sample had been ordinary conglomerate, there was an easy way to end the whole thing. You publish the result. You say, plainly, that the careful diver was wrong, that the wall was natural rock and the arch a trick of fracture, and you let the story die the clean death it deserves. Nothing kills a legend faster than a boring lab report. That report would have cost almost nothing and settled almost everything, and it never came. You can read that absence 2 ways. Either no one bothered to test a piece of gravel, which is entirely possible, or the test was run and the result was not the boring one, which is the possibility that keeps people awake at night. A negative finding is cheap to release and easy to forget. It is the findings that are not negative that tend to go quiet, and stay quiet, and take the people who held them along into the quiet as well. Now, I want to steelman the boring explanation, because it is important, and it is probably, in most cases like this, correct. The boring explanation is that a real diver found a genuinely unusual but entirely natural formation, that the flat floor and the corner and the arch were the ordinary tricks that cast plays, and that the survey went unfiled for the most human reason of all, fear of embarrassment. He knew that the moment he described a moulded wall and a load-bearing arch under the water table, his reputation would be tied to a claim he could not fully back, so he sat on it. The sample got lost in the mail, or was tested, and came back as ordinary conglomerate, and admitting that felt worse than saying nothing. The passage collapsed on its own schedule, the way passages do, and the story grew in the retelling, as stories do, until a modest anomaly became a buried factory of a lost world. That explanation covers almost everything, and if this were the only case, I would probably lean on it and move on. But it is not the only case, and this is the part that the revisionist economic historians want you to understand, because the individual story is not really their point, the pattern is their point. Their argument goes like this. All over the built world, there are things that do not fit the economy that supposedly made them. There are canals that would have required more organized labor than the recorded population could supply. There are foundations under ordinary buildings that are far heavier and more precise than the building above them ever needed. There are stretches of old wall, in cities and out in the country, that were clearly made by people who understood mass and load and permanence at a level the surrounding history does not otherwise show. The mainstream explanation for each individual case is reasonable. It is the sum of the cases that starts to feel strained. And the cases are not all far away and ancient. Some of them are in living memory. There are photographs, barely a century or so old, of exposition halls and civic buildings of a scale and finish that the cities around them supposedly could not have afforded, thrown up in a matter of months, used for a single season, and then, according to the record, demolished on purpose. Buildings that would take years to design and raise today, gone almost as soon as they appeared, with the official reason being that they were only ever meant to be temporary. A civilization that builds palaces of plaster and iron for a summer and then knocks them down is either unimaginably rich or is not the civilization that built them. The revisionists look at those photographs and see inheritance again. Structures already standing, repurposed and rebranded, and then cleared away before too many people could ask who really raised them. And the economy is the key word. Because construction is not magic. It is labor and material and organization and time, which is to say, it is money, in whatever form money took. A civilization that builds heavy and builds precise and builds everywhere is a civilization with a surplus. It has extra. It has enough food and enough order that it can afford to put thousands of hours into a wall that could have been a fence. When you find that kind of construction without the matching records of that kind of surplus, you have a hole in the books. Either the records were lost, or the records were removed, or the surplus came from somewhere the standard story does not describe. It helps to think of a building as frozen money. Every worked stone is stored labor. Someone fed the people who cut it, housed the people who moved it, organized the people who set it in place. All of that effort gets locked into the wall and stays there, legible to anyone who knows how to read it, for as long as the wall stands. This is why construction is such an honest witness. You can burn the ledgers and rewrite the chronicles, but you cannot fake the labor already sitting in 100 tons of precisely fitted stone. The wall remembers what it cost, even when the books have forgotten. So when you find a wall that clearly cost a fortune in stored labor, in a place with no record of the fortune that paid for it, you are looking at a contradiction that cannot simply be talked away. The labor happened. The surplus existed. Someone, at some point, had the extra to spend. The only question is why the memory of that surplus is missing, and there are only a few ways a memory that large goes missing. It fails to be written down, which for something this expensive is unlikely. It gets destroyed, which happens more often than anyone likes to admit. Or it gets quietly reassigned, credited to a later, smaller, more convenient set of builders who were happy to accept the compliment. The Missouri Chamber, if it is what the diver thought it was, is a small, wet, inconvenient dot in that larger pattern. It is a place where the building exists and the receipts do not. And more than that, it is a place where the receipts, in the form of a survey and a lab result, were being created in real time by careful people and then stopped existing anyway. That is the detail that should bother even the skeptics, not the arch, not the wall, the paperwork, because a natural formation does not need its paperwork suppressed. If the chamber were an ordinary geological curiosity, the survey would have been filed and would sit in a drawer gathering dust, read by no one, threatening nothing. Boring things get filed all the time. It is the interesting things that go missing, and whatever else you believe about this story, the survey went missing. It is worth understanding what filing a survey actually means, because the phrase sounds like a formality, and it is not. A cave survey is a legal and scientific document. It records the location, the passages, the measurements, the hazards. It is how a system enters the shared map that other divers, land managers, and researchers rely on. Filing it is how a discovery stops being one person's story and becomes part of the record that everyone else has to reckon with. An unfiled survey is a discovery that, officially, never happened. The room can be as real as the hand that measured it, and if the paper never enters the system, then to the map, to the archive, to the next generation of divers, there is nothing down there but rock. That is the quiet power of a missing document. You do not have to disprove a thing. You do not have to argue with it or explain it away. You simply decline to record it, and time does the rest. The people who saw it grow old. The passage closes. The story drifts into the pile of things that cannot be checked, and the map, which is the only version of the world most people will ever consult, stays clean. This is not a dramatic conspiracy of shadowy figures in a locked room. It is something far more durable. It is the ordinary preference of every institution for a record that does not embarrass it applied patiently, over a long enough stretch of time to make almost anything disappear. Let's talk about who benefits from a hole in the record, because the revisionist argument does not stop at the buildings, it follows the money forward. If there was an earlier phase, an earlier organized economy that built heavy and built well and then collapsed or was ended, then a great deal of what came after was not built from nothing, it was inherited. The later people, the ones the textbooks credit, would have walked into a world that already had foundations in it, already had walls and works and structures too large to move, and they would have built on top. And when the time came to write the history, the honest version, the one where you admit the best of your infrastructure was already here when you arrived, is not a flattering version. It is much better, if you are the inheritor, to say you built it all yourself. Whether or not you accept that as the story of the whole world, it is at least a coherent motive. History gets written by the people holding the pen at the end, and the people holding the pen have every reason to close the gaps rather than point at them. A missing survey is a very small pen stroke in a very old habit. I have gone back and forth on this chamber for a long time, and I want to tell you where I have landed, because I think it is the only honest place to land. I do not know if the wall was cast. I do not know if the arch would carry a load or crack under it. I do not know if the flat floor was a builder's level or a lake's patience. And neither does anyone else, because the one thing that could have answered it, the sample, is exactly the thing that disappeared. That is not proof of a conspiracy, but it is a strange, recurring shape. The evidence in these stories has a way of surviving right up until the moment it would have to be tested, and then it does not survive. What I do believe is that the chamber was real, that the man who found it was not a liar, and that something about what he described was frightening enough to someone that the ordinary machinery of recording it did not run. Maybe the someone was him. Maybe the fear was only of looking foolish. That is the most likely answer, and I will not pretend otherwise. But the water is still down there. The hill is still there. Karst systems reopen as often as they close, and the Ozarks are riddled with passages no one has mapped. Somewhere below the level where the rock is supposed to behave, there may still be a flat floor and a clean corner and an arch that someone decided to build. And if the arch is real, then the economy that raised it is real, and the books that recorded that economy are somewhere, or were somewhere, and the reason we cannot read them is a question worth more than a shrug. The people who filed this away were betting that no one would go back for it, that the passage would stay closed, the diver would stay quiet, and the story would fold back into the long list of things that almost were. It is a safe bet. It usually pays off. The buildings stay standing, and the receipts stay missing, and the world keeps crediting the wrong hands, because it is easier, and because the alternative asks us to admit that we do not actually know who built the floor beneath the floor. But safe bets are not the same as true ones, and a survey that was never filed is not the same as a chamber that was never there. The chamber is there, 90 feet down, in cold fresh water, under a hill in Missouri that most people will drive past forever without a second glance, waiting, the way it has apparently waited for a very long time, for someone stubborn enough to bring the paperwork all the way back up. And someday, someone just has to want the answer more than it stays hidden.